Hey, welcome back to the videos. I thought for the next couple of videos we would look at string bends, otherwise known as chokes, on the banjo, and look at some more advanced ways to play chokes and some more interesting ways to use them. Typically in a bluegrass banjo situation, when you mention a choke, the first place a banjo player would go in a bluegrass situation would be the 10th fret of the second string, and they would do a series of chokes on that string individually or in a roll pattern, a la bluegrass breakdown, or any of the standard breaks up the neck. A lot of times it would be that choke you would hear on the second string. And all a choke or a bent note is an attempt to raise the pitch of a string by bending it. Pretty similar to what you do with a D tuner when you swing it down and back. You slur the tuning of the string to make it go up or down. You can raise the pitch of a string, which is called a bend, up as far as you think the string can go. In this case, like in the Foggy Mountain Breakdown example, you're typically doing what was known as a half-step bend. You're raising the tone of that string one fret, which is one half-step, musically speaking. I could do a whole note or a whole tone bend, and I can make this A note, which is the note you're choking at the 10th fret, sound like a B note, which is a whole step apart, musically speaking. But there are physical limits to how strong your finger is that you're choking with, how far you can stretch the string before it breaks, because you can overload the string and break it. And typically, as you go up the neck, this way the strings are easier to choke because there's less tension, and harder to choke as you get closer to the nut because the string coming through the nut has more tension on it. So most of the really effective bluegrass bends you hear or choke notes are done somewhere in the middle of the neck. But there are a lot of other great places to do bends, and the purpose of this video is to show you some more ideas and maybe expose you to some ideas that you've heard and want to try, or maybe that you've not heard before. So let's just jump right in. The first thing I'm going to do is bend a string in context of a chord shape, and this is an easy and effective way to add some variety to your bends, and also allows you to adapt the bend ideas from a real famous instrument, which is a steel guitar. Sonny Osmond was one of the first guys I remember ever hearing doing pedal steel guitar effects on the banjo. So, of course, Sonny was a genius at a lot of things he did on the banjo. But all the players now who do these pedal guitar bends on the banjo owe a big debt of gratitude to Sonny for making it safe, as they say, to do that. But let's examine the number 2 chord shape, which is also called the D shape in this video. One really effective tool to make your banjo kind of have that pedal steel effect is to add an E note to a G chord. And when you do that, we come up with this complicated formula of a G6 chord, which basically means you add the 6th note of a G scale to the other 3 notes of a G chord. So in this formation, the 3rd string is a D note, the 2nd string is my G, and the pinky is holding the B note. So I have D, G, and B as my 3 chord notes, called a triad. Now when I bend this D note with my index finger, physically, watch what happens. Oops, wrong string. If I do a whole tone bend and then release it, I slur the sound of a D note up to an E note and then back to a D. Now that by itself is pretty cool sounding, but if I use it in the context of a pinch, I'll pinch the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd strings together, and at the same time do a choke, a whole tone choke, and then release it, and listen what happens. It sounds a lot like a steel guitar. Now a steel guitar it's a pretty complex instrument. It has a series of levers, knee bars, and pedals that allow you to mechanically change the pitch of strings as you hold that steel bar on there. Okay, we can mimic that sound on the banjo by playing a chord or a part of a chord and adding these chokes. Now, in essence, what I'm doing is the same thing as doing this. I could physically play a D note with my index finger and then play an E note with my ring. And that sounds good, and I can do the pinch again, the tremolo. And that sounds like changing from a G major to a G major 6 chord, but it's not nearly as neat sounding and doesn't have that slur effect or the steel guitar effect like it does when I do the choke. So we can give this choke a title. I'm going to call this pedal steel 6, maybe a pedal 6. I don't know. we'll give it some kind of name. But we're changing this G chord into a G6 chord and getting that cool pedal sound. So we'll call this our G6 pedal lick. Now the cool thing about this is because it's based on a chord shape, you can physically move this anywhere on the neck and reproduce that same sound over all 12 major chords. So here is a C version, same chord shape, moved up to 12 and 14, and by doing the same exact bend, I'm actually going from a G note on the 3rd string to an A note. So if I add an A note to a C chord, again a little theory thrown in, I'd have a C major 6 chord. Even if you don't know the names of these notes, that's not really important. If you can physically just manage to do the choke, you can get a pedal 6 steel effect, whatever we decide to call this. Now if I move it up to a D, here's a D chord, and again I'm not even fretting the 4th string because we're not playing that note, so that frees my ring finger up to just kind of hang up in the air. The index finger is really doing all the work. But again, I can move this anywhere. Here's an A, this would be an A6 pedal bend. Here's an F6 pedal bend. And one of the cool things about this type of choke in a chord shape is it adds more sustain to the banjo because you have 3 notes ringing at the same time instead of 1. So you have the power of 3 notes, which makes the banjo sustain a little longer, and you get this just really beautiful effect. And this would be a great technique to use in slower country type songs because a lot of times banjo players complain that you can't play the banjo in slow songs. Well, obviously that's not right. You can play the banjo in any tempo of song, but you have to change your approach because Scruggs licks and Scruggs backup licks, fill-in licks are designed to be rolled out and played at certain tempos, and when the song is really slow, the vast majority of the Scruggs ideas just fall apart because the notes are too spread apart. They lose their cohesiveness and they just sound like they just don't work. So one of the things we talked about in the previous video was doing tremolo in slower songs. You can also combine tremolo with pedal steel bends and you get some really cool sounding country effects. And again, using bend and then release in that pattern. So play around with these pedal 6 effects out of that number 2 shape, and what we'll do in the next few videos is kind of just add to that, use some different chord formations, and I'm going to try to show you some really interesting ways to use chokes, not just individually but in chord shapes, much like a steel guitar. And have fun with this, and we'll see you next video. Thanks.